Good evening to our viewers in the Philippines and Asia, and good day to those logging in from other parts of the globe. I'm Tantan Mina of Ayala Museum, and I will be hosting tonight's program. Before our program begins, we have a few reminders shown on the screen. A recording of this evening's program will be available on our social media pages. For tech support, contact us through our chat on the Facebook page. If you have questions for our speakers, please type it in the Q&A box for our Zoom attendees or in the comments section of our simultaneous Facebook Live video. We'll try our best to address it during the live Q&A session at the end of the discussion. To officially begin our program, please welcome Ms. Mariles Gustilo, Senior Director of the Ayala Museum.
Hello, I'm Mariles Gustilo, Senior Director for Arts and Culture of the Ayala Foundation. Welcome to the newly renovated Ayala Museum. Established in the early 1970s, the Ayala Museum, as well as the Filipinas Heritage Library, has long been the Foundation's center for its arts and culture advocacy. In March 2014, the Ayala Museum was privileged to host an international conference entitled Transpacific Engagements, Visual Culture of Global Exchange, brought about by a collaboration of the Getty Research Institute, the Kunst Florence, and Ayala Foundation. The conference saw international scholars mingle with their local counterparts to discuss new ideas and inspiring conversations. Out of that conference grew the book we're about to discuss this evening, but with a slightly longer title, Transpacific Engagements, Trade, Translation, and Visual Culture of Entangled Empires. More than just a record of the proceedings of the conference, the book has expanded the temporal and geographical framework of the conference in order to contribute to the dynamically expanding area of Trans-Pacific studies. For stepping up to the plate, our kudos must go to the editors of the book, namely Florina Nina Capistrano-Baker and Meha Priya Darshini. This evening, Nina and Meha will engage a global panel of scholars to discuss the book's contribution to the area of Trans-Pacific studies, as well as to their own research. This book talk is the second in a series organized by the publishers of the book, namely Getty Research Institute, the Kunst Florence, and Ayala Foundation. I hope you will find this evening's discussion stimulating. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Ms. Mariles. And now, let me briefly introduce our program. Tonight, we are joined by esteemed scholars from around the globe, specializing in fields of research addressed or related to topics in the volume Transpacific Engagements. Our speakers this evening are Dr. Ruth Llobet, Visiting Clinical Assistant Professor of History at NYU Shanghai, Dr. Aaron Hyman, Assistant Professor at the Department of History of Art at the Johns Hopkins University, and Dr. Stephanie Porras, Chair and Associate Professor at the Newcombe Art Department at Tulane University. Each of our invited panelists will briefly share their thoughts and research related to the publication, after which we will invite the editors of the volume, Dr. Meha Priya Darshini and Dr. Florina Capistrano-Baker, to respond. Dr. Priya Darshini specializes in early modern global history, focusing especially on connections between Asia and colonial Latin America. And Dr. Capistrano-Baker has received her PhD and Master's in Philosophy and Master's in Arts from the Department of Art History and Archaeology at Columbia University, and has received numerous grants and fellowships from institutions such as the Asian Cultural Council, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Getty Research Institute. And now it is with pleasure that I introduce our first speaker for the evening. We have Dr. Ruth Franch de Llobet, who is a Visiting Clinical Assistant Professor of History at the New York University in Shanghai. Her work looks at the significant role of Manila's Criollo community, Eurasians born or raised in the Philippines, in the construction of Filipino political thought during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. She is currently developing a second monographic research project in which she explores how the Chinese mestizo community, a transnational group, transformed itself into Filipino elite in the late 18th century by co-opting colonial institutions. She is currently working on 2 manuscripts regarding the history of the Philippines. The first one is Demostración de Misero, Estado de las Islas Filipinas, a proyectista economic colonial program of the Philippines, and Orphans of Empire, Bourbon Reforms, Constitutional Impasse, and the Rise of Filipino Creole Consciousness in the Age of Revolution. May I call to the floor Dr. Llobet.
Hi, good night and good morning to everyone. Thank you very much to Nina Baker and Meha Priya, I hope that I will pronounce it well, Priya Darshini, and also the Ayala Foundation for inviting me to give this talk about this excellent book. Since I have just only 10 minutes, I have decided to divide this brief intervention in 3 points. One, it will be a first kind of like a small, because I'm a historian, a sociopolitical historian, not so much into material culture and art history. I will give first a small summary of the book. Then I will include, or I will frame the book within the multiple Filipino historiographies or Philippine historiographical debates. And then finally, I will put the research, my research in dialogue with the book. So let's begin with the summary of the book. So people in the audience that have not read the book at least will be able also to follow us in the dialogue. So the book is divided in 3 parts, and its chronological scope goes from the 16th to the 19th century. It has 3 sections: Entangled Empires, Empires and Translation, and Empires and Trade. In the first part, we have Vicente Rafael's overview on the colonial history of the Philippines, followed by Ricardo Padron's exploration of an imperial political discourse from the archipelago, exploring the making of maps and introducing the political dimension of an object. The last is Sean Nelson's piece on Hawaii's King Kalakaua's trip to Japan, in which he wished to obtain support vis-a-vis the increasing threat of the American claim over Hawaii. Hawaii's situation mirrored later the circumstances in which the Philippines found itself during the Republic of Malolos to gain recognition internationally to withstand the US advances. In this first part, framed by Rafael's work, we see how empires are constituted not only by the people, territory, and culture of the metropolis, but by the people in the peripheries, whites and non-whites, who instrumentalize, reinforce, as well as resist, and therefore inform the advances and character of those empires. The second part of the book explores a set of intellectual texts and artistic artifacts, books, religious sculptures, paintings, from the perspective of translation. Translation is understood not only as a process, but also as an idea or concept that relates to the ways in which human interactions were built over time, and therefore debunking binary approaches to cultural exchange. The first chapter addresses Juan Cobo Shilu, a very important book in a sense that represents or explains, is the first time that a European in Chinese explains Catholicism as a rational belief system, as well as starts introducing the first ideas, the first scientific ideas, European scientific ideas in China. The second chapter is Garcia Brosseau's look at the Flemish, Indian, Native American, Spanish, and Portuguese iconographic influences in shaping a common religious discourse against heresy and idolatry, sharing different imperial and colonial spaces. The third chapter is an exploration of imperial visual and material culture through the transcultural engagement of Chinese as well as European artists with Chinese and European pictorial techniques, which create in the process a new cosmopolitan artistic language within the frame of the Qing Empire. Within this framework of artistic cosmopolitanism, we see also the last 3 chapters of the second section that they are dedicated to understand how transculturality, the process of cultural translation, happened in the Philippines through Rococo, Philippine Rococo in the 18th century, miniaturismo in the 19th century, and food. Finally, the book's third and final section is dedicated to the role of the galleon trade in disseminating a cosmopolitan material culture, embodied in textiles, ivories, paintings, and aesthetics, making the Philippines not only a space in which transculturality happened, but also from which, via the galleon, these transcultural objects, these translations were disseminated. This section shows how trade overall and intra-imperial trade specifically, personified by the US traders in China and in the Philippines after the galleon was abolished in 1814, circulate Philippine, Asian, and Trans-Pacific transculturality constructed in translation. By ending this way, the book not only defies Euro and Western-centric visions of transculturality from above, but also defies narrow-minded nationalistic approaches from below, rethinking the history of the Filipino archipelago, Asia, and the Trans-Pacific Wall as multidirectional and hierarchically complex, going beyond what empires in the past and nation states in the present want us to believe. Which brings us to the second part of this short presentation, the role of this volume within the wider Philippine historiography. This work is important because it speaks to different Philippine historiographies, as well as the new global historiographical approach to the field of history. On the one hand, this volume exemplifies the recent change of direction within Filipino historiography to engage more with the Spanish Empire, as well as with the Trans-Pacific Wall, to understand how Hispanic legacies configure an important part of Filipino culture, normalizing long historical periods at the local level. In turn, by embracing these Trans-Pacific and Hispanic legacies, it engaged with the Hispanic historiography, mainly Spanish and Mexican, which sadly has understood the archipelago as an extension of their territory or a backdoor of the empire. By representing the archipelago as a space that articulates a global exchange, parallel to the one that was simultaneously configured in the Americas. And finally, it confronts a Philippine historiography based in the USA that has been impermeable in most of the cases to external aesthetics and cultural influences outside of the European world, by showing how Chinese and Filipino aesthetics, besides being representations of how a future empire looked, shaped the taste of the in the US, at least among an elite. This book responds to all of these Philippine historiographies by juxtaposing theoretical and methodological approaches. Theoretically, by exploring the transculturality of iconographies, myths, ideas, and techniques through the concept of translation as a vehicle to transmit artistic languages and material culture. And methodologically, by juxtaposing the approach of different authors to a similar topic. For example, there are 3 articles that deal directly or indirectly with the Cantonese export paintings and the cultural and artistic significance, while Marco Musillo approaches it as an encounter of new languages, aesthetics, and techniques in China that were not shaped by visions of inferiority or superiority, but rather of exchange, curiosity, and desire for a new aesthetic by the Qing emperors. Yi He Jiang explores Cantonese export painters as a phenomenon brought by trade, and Nina Capistrano Baker as an antecedent to understand the later dissemination of Filipino paintings. These theoretical and methodological approaches open a dialogue, not only with a global historiography centered around art and material culture, but also with other historiographical approaches. And then brings me to the last part, the third and last part of this brief talk. And basically is, as Dr. Capistrano Baker requests us that to the 3 presenters to reflect in how the volume dialogue with their own work. And of course, I am not, as I said, I am not a historian of art or a material culture historian either. My area of expertise is mainly sociopolitical history within Southeast Asia. And then within that big label, I am a historian of the Philippines and of the Spanish Empire. So this volume resonates with my work in content, methodology, and theoretical perspectives in the following ways. Content-wise, the volume is framed chronologically between the 16th and the 19th centuries. The historical scope of my research is the late 18th century, early mid-19th century. So some of the articles addresses processes that I have studied from a different perspective and focus. For example, Benito Legarda and Nina Capistrano-Baker situate the historical topics within a similar chronological framework, which means that there are historical figures in the chapters that appear in the documentation I work on. And then I think in one person that actually called my attention immediately is Barreto. No, Barreto was a trader in the 1820s in Manila, and he's in Legarda's piece is connected with American traders. However, I knew him because he played a role within the implementation of the 1812 Constitution. Then methodologically speaking, the volume reflects a vision that I have always pursued in my research, the juxtaposition of visions of a same subject. In my own research regarding the implementation of the 1812 Constitution in Manila, I have explored how it was received and instrumentalized by different social groups within the city, as well as in the Manila hinterland. Finally, theoretically, the idea of translation as a process of transculturality, it is also present in my work on the 1812 Constitution. When I was working, I'm working currently in an article on the countryside, and then one of the elements that plays a key role in understanding politics is actually all the interpretations and translations of the Constitution, as well as my work on Francisco Leandro de Viana and my analysis of his famous Memorial of 1765, which became the blueprint of the Bourbon reforms in the Philippines. Overall, this volume is not only a significant contribution to Philippine historiography, but also to an intra-imperial, as well as a trans-Pacific historiography that encompasses 3 continents. Maraming salamat.
Thank you very much, Dr. Llobet, for that very well put together and very concise presentation. And now may I introduce our next speaker for this evening. We are joined by Dr. Aaron Hyman, who is an assistant professor in the Department of the History of Art at the Johns Hopkins University. He works on early modern art in a global frame, with a particular focus on Northern Europe and colonial Latin America. He is the author of Rubens in Repeat, The Logic of the Copy in Colonial Latin America from the Getty Research Institute, launched in 2021. He has been the recipient of grants from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, and the Belgian American Educational Foundation, among others. And his research is currently supported by the American Council of Learned Societies, the Newberry Library, and the Thomas Foundation. Dr. Hyman?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that generous introduction. Let me go ahead and get some slides up here. Okay. So first of all, I want to thank, of course, the Ayala specifically, along with the Kunsthistorisches Institute and the Getty Research Institute for the invitation to speak today. And I also want to signal my gratitude to Nina Capistrano-Baker and Meha Priyadarshini, not only for having me here, but also for producing this really wonderful volume. And thank you to Ruth for summarizing its different pieces so both thoroughly and cogently and concisely. The volume, to my mind, is just an absolute model for so many of the things that we're striving for in art history specifically and in the humanities more broadly. It's obviously collaborative, it's transnational, not just in its subject matter, but also in the group of scholars that are brought together. It's interdisciplinary in method and again in the group assembled, and it's transtemporal across a really long array that's covered. So in getting started, I just want to applaud the editors for these things and also recognize the challenges that they undoubtedly face in cultivating those aspects of this volume and the rewards that we have as readers for you having done so. So thank you very much. I've titled my short presentation today, Form, Material, Transatlantic, Transpacific, as a set of binaries that, while perhaps overly didactic or rigid, I mean, absolutely overly didactic and rigid, have, I think, structured a lot of the art historical work about the Spanish Empire and its overseas interactions. And I should just say and underline that I come to this material as an art historian of the Spanish Empire, broadly construed. Almost 3 years ago, which now sort of feels like a complete and total lifetime in this weird pandemic timeframe we live in, but 3 years ago, I went to San Luis Potosi, the former mining and missionary outpost in New Spain. I went to look at paintings, one shipped from Mexico City, 400 kilometers to the north, to San Luis Potosí. And here you see the facade of the Museo del Virreinato, the museum that houses viceregal and colonial art in the city. But a step inside, and I was confronted by a very different set of objects than what I had been expecting, and a story of much longer distances and trade intervals. The museum had mounted a relatively small but very robust exhibition on the Trans-Pacific trade, on the Manila galleons and their impact on New Spain. And here you see a biombo that was loaned from the Franz Mayer Museum in Mexico City. On the one hand, that's not altogether odd. After all, we know well that northern territories of New Spain were deeply impacted by the transit of Asian goods, if perhaps not to the same degree as a metropolis like Mexico City or port cities like Acapulco and Veracruz. On the other, it was notable how the show staged in a small regional museum of this type ticked through the materials of a now very familiar narrative. So in the case of this biombo made in 18th century New Spain, the stress was placed on the way that the format of the screen itself came from Asia, and particularly from Japanese examples. Here I'm showing you a biobu with a kind of prototypical mobilization of gold, specifically throughout the clouds that reveal the scenes below. On the new Spanish example, we have the folding format taken up for what appears to be scenes of an Asian court, but so too the material qualities of gold, mobilized here for everything from door frames to costume details to broad swaths of foliage. The show centered other materials, here a late 17th century silk rebozo, or shawl woven in Michoacan. Of course, it was responding to luxurious Asian textiles that were coming on Manila galleon, often illicitly. The rebozo actually has silver threads woven into it to amplify the shine of locally produced silk thread, which, as we can see here, did not always meet the luster of Asian varietals so carefully cultivated and skillfully woven. The exhibit also offered examples of one of the most robust New Spanish responses to the Trans-Pacific trade, the introduction of Chinese porcelain shipped via the Philippines, and then all manner of creations spurred on in the city of Puebla de Los Angeles and its famous blue and white Talavera de la Reina, a kind of faux porcelain of the sort produced in many places in the 17th and 18th century, like Delftware in the Netherlands. Finally, there was the question of lacquerware, both Chinese and Japanese examples exported to the Americas, where they inspired the production of objects using a related but distinct pre-Columbian technique. This technique, too, yielded a shiny and hard surface. There were other aspects of this show in San Luis Potosí, a room of maps, for instance, a heavy focus in this volume, and also a section on the infamous and so-called Hispano-Philippine ivories, which I know Dr. Stephanie Porras is going to speak more about today. But I've pulled out these objects because they were positioned in that show to reflect, I think, what has been the dominant narrative of the Trans-Pacific trade in the Spanish Empire, at least in art history. Goods were shipped from Asia to the Americas, and vice-regal makers tried to effectuate their visual and material forms. And there are a host of reasons they did this. These range from the fairly banal. Goods from Asia were costly and fairly scarce, so makers met this demand, to the fairly heady. These goods inspired people who had an aesthetic response to them. But at baseline, this is a story about copying, of New Spain mimetically responding to Asian goods. But it's a form of mimesis that happens largely at the level of material. And I mean this in a broad sense to encompass the mobilization of literally the same materials and formats and techniques that effectuated the aesthetic properties of those materials themselves. That is, to a certain extent, unsurprising. Empires demand mimesis, and they inculcate it as a response. The forms of the metropole need to be remade in the colony. Bureaucracy needs to be extended through reproduction. Modes of behavior are inculcated so that citizens far apart match and understand themselves as such, as citizens. What I want to foreground, though, is how the story of the Trans-Pacific has so heavily centered questions of material in expressing or exploring that relationship. And the reason is that that is not so often the way that transatlantic stories of mimesis or of copying have been framed. So here I show you a print of the Virgin's Assumption to Heaven, produced after a design made by the Flemish artist Peter Paul Rubens. It was made in Antwerp, and many, many impressions were shipped after stopping in Seville in Spain across the Atlantic to Latin America. There, artists put them to use. Every year, tens of thousands of European printed sheets landed in the Spanish Americas and were mobilized to make other works of art. Here we see an oil painting made after Rubens's design by the Mexico City-based painter Cristobal de Villalpando in the last quarter of the 17th century. The European print became a constitutive factor in colonial artistic production, and these prints were often referenced in the specifications of artistic contracts. Not infrequently, in fact, a patron would supply an artist with a print, stipulating in their contractual commission that the final product should conform to the graphic source. Conforme a la estampa que recibe is often how this is described in period documentation. So the notion of conformity between source and model became a guiding principle of colonial artistic production. A little bit of a shameless plug here. I explore this idea of conformity in my recent book, which was also published by the Getty Research Institute last year. I dub a term conforming copy, rather than calling such works simply copies, in order to capture and underscore period concerns about exactly what it was that artists worked to transfer from one support to the next when they were working with prints. The Latin root of conform, conformis, to share forms indicates what was at stake. Conformity was a widely used word in the period and could be a loosely abstract notion, like the sharing of behaviors or affectations. Yet where the visual arts were concerned, it was more literal, a sharing of visual forms between multiple artistic instantiations of a single composition. In asking painters to produce a work of art that conformed, patrons implicitly acknowledged a difference between model and resulting work of art. This would be a copy, but one that might differ dramatically in terms of scale, material, and style. After all, the painting or the sculpture could never be the print, and patrons did not, of course, really want another printed object. Instead, they needed something, whether painted or sculpted, that did similar visual work, but in a different scale and medium. Period sources, quite notably, do not speak of reproduction or replication, but yet more importantly, they generally speak of neither style nor manner. Instead, conformity stressed formal repetition, a sharing of forms between two or more objects. And here I'm showing you a print of the Raising of the Cross, designed again by Rubens, printed in Antwerp, and then three instantiations of those forms, all in churches on the central square, the Plaza de Armas, in Cusco, Peru. It is with this question of form that I'm trying to draw out something of a binary between the ways in which the transatlantic and the transpacific have been approached. Both discourses have tended towards questions of mimesis, but where the transatlantic might be a space of formal exchange and reproduction, the transpacific has generally been more often framed as one of material mimesis. So a question for me emerges. How do we think those things or those discourses together in moving forward? And I take it as one of the latent questions posed by the volume that we're here to celebrate today. I want to offer in closing two examples that, to my mind, show what it might look like or illustrate potential avenues for that kind of thinking together. The first is an assumption of the Virgin, based on the same printed design by Rubens that we have already seen. It was crafted in Mexico City by the brothers Juan and Miguel Gonzalez. The composition takes from the print its forms, which were sketched onto a panel. But then pieces of mother of pearl were inset to define bodies and drapery. The hands and faces were painted with an opaque pigment. Then the artist applied semi-transparent oil glazes and thick black contour lines to finalize the form. The object is quintessentially colonial. Its materials and technique, mother of pearl, inlaid and oil slicked, originated in China and Japan, shipped on the Manila galleon to New Spain from the Philippines. An object like this enconchado assumption then could only have been produced in Latin America, situated as it was at the literal crossroads between East and West. The object represents a condensation of colonial visual systems and global commodity circuits. That is, we see the mediation between a conforming copy, the question of form in a transatlantic sphere, with the material mimesis, the adoption of shimmering aesthetic effects from the Transpacific. So that's one example. The second is an allegory of the four continents, painted by the mulatto artist Juan Correa around 1680. To depict the four regal couples and their attendants, groupings that allegorize the four known continents, Correa meticulously conformed to a series of European prints, Les Quatre Parties du Monde, published by the Paris-based François Mazeau. But as we can see, Correa was not producing an oil-on-canvas painting of the traditional variety. Rather, the breaks or articulations single a biombo format, again inspired by East Asian-style folding screens. Correa himself was well aware of the geographic origins of the biombo format upon which he painted. In fact, some years earlier, he had served as an appraiser for a probate inventory, offering his specialist opinion and signing off on a long list of objects. And when he did this, they included, quote, a biombo of 10 panels painted on both sides that imitates those of Japan. That is, he understood the biombo format to have originated in Asia. When he went to make his own biombo then, Correa was joining geographies through form and material. His compositions came from Europe, the format upon which he worked from Asia. He himself, of course, painted in New Spain, that is in the Americas, and he was himself of African and European lineage, a mulatto libre painter. Various geographic trajectories, that of Correa's lineage, the format in which he worked, and the prints from which he copied, intersected in this painterly endeavor and were amplified by the subject matter itself. The allegorical figures of his biombo were embodiments of the very continents from which objects and forms, those objects and forms with which Correa worked, had themselves come. The print's arrival in Correa's workshop thus produced a scene that triangulated bodies, both real and painted, and the tools of the artistic trade into a geographic relationship. With his brush, Correa allegorically animated the global geographies of empire, visualizing bodies that stood in for continents, separated by oceans, and positioned within routes that the Spanish Empire attempted to control. The painter quite literally staged an encounter between those allegorical bodies, whom he painted into being on the panels before him, and his own body, one racially marked by the very distances he collapsed in situating these figures within a single extended frame of a folding screen. These are the kind of narratives that I see prompted by looking for objects that stitch together both the transatlantic and the Transpacific. But I'd like to make 2 points to close. One, stitching narratives together will only be possible if we continue to make the Transpacific story as robust as that of the transatlantic, which has tended to play, at least in art history, a dominant role in the histories of the Spanish Americas to this point. And it is here that the volume we're here to celebrate is so very much appreciated. The second point is that I want to recognize that I have spoken about the Pacific in terms only about those geographies of the Spanish Empire. That reflects my own deficiency to some extent, though also I think a general limit in the field's thinking. The real triumph of this volume is the way that it centers the Transpacific well beyond the Manila-Acapulco axis. We get an equally robust treatment of US imperialism in the Pacific, the impact of Asian aesthetics in the far north of North America, so New England, inter-Pacific questions that circumvent empire entirely, and also a truly broad timescale, one escaping imperial boundaries, at least single imperial boundaries entirely, across which these questions and themes are staged. So that's all extremely exciting and also really relativizes the role of empire to begin with, pointing to the trans-imperial spaces that no doubt will structure art historical inquiry in the years to come when we all look back at this volume as a starting point. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hyman, for that very interesting contrast and comparison between what you call trans-Pacific and transatlantic mimesis, and of course the different iterations of material culture as it travels across these large bodies of water. And finally, may I introduce our last speaker for this evening, Dr. Stephanie Porras, who specializes in the visual and material culture of Northern Europe and the Spanish world from the 15th to the 17th centuries. She is an associate professor of art history and chair of the Newcombe Art Department at Tulane University. She has published widely on the art of the Northern Renaissance and is the author of the book Peter Bruegel's Historical Imagination, Art of the Northern Renaissance, Courts, Commerce, Devotion, and the forthcoming title, The First Viral Images, Martin de Vaux's Antwerp Print and the Early Modern Globe. Dr. Porras.
Hello, I'm just going to share my screen. First of all, I want to say thank you to the organizers of this fantastic event. And thank you to Meha and Nina for their editorial work on this volume. I'm delighted to be talking to you today from sort of early morning New Orleans. And I'm happy to present a short reflection on the wonderful volume we're sort of celebrating tonight, which I have here, and to offer an introduction to how it relates to themes explored in my own work, which connects the visual and material cultures of Flanders, New Spain or Mexico, and the Philippines. I'm particularly grateful for how this volume brings together materials not only from centuries worth of the galleon trade and its vast geographies, but also specialists on specific materials, sites, and routes from the Americas, connecting the Americas, Asia, and Europe. And I want to start with a quotation included in Ana Ruiz Gutierrez's essay on the artistic production of Manila's Perian, written by the new Bishop of Manila to the Spanish King Philip II in 1590. And he writes, "What arouses my wonder the most is that when I arrived, no Sanglais knew how to paint anything, but now they have so perfected themselves in this art that they have wrought marvelous works, both with the chisel and the brush. Having seen some infant Jesus figures in ivory, it seems to me that nothing more perfect than these could be produced, and such is the opinion of those who have seen them. The churches are now being provided with such images, which they sorely lacked before. With their ability to replicate those images that come from Spain, I understand that it should not be long when even those made in Flanders will not be missed." This quote, as Ruiz Gutierrez points out, indicates that from the earliest days of Spanish colonization, there was a robust local artistic industry in the archipelago. But what I have stressed in my work on these Hispano-Philippine ivories that I'm showing you on the right are the networks and infrastructures that connected Manila to Flanders in this period. And I'm thinking very much of Meha's contribution in the volume, which really breaks down very usefully the mechanics of this galleon trade, right? From the wooden chests that are used to pack materials and objects to the construction of galleon ships themselves in Luzon. The mobility of specific styles, ornamental motifs, techniques, and materials are all beautifully reconstructed in essays by Ricky Tortojose, Felice Presidente Santa Maria, Santa Castro, and Elena Phillips. And Ana Ruiz Gutierrez and Esperanza Benang Gatboton both write specifically about ivories produced in Manila and shipped across the Pacific to markets in both Latin America and Spain. So what I would like to sort of focus my brief remarks to you this evening on are two further examples of ivories that illustrate these intersecting geographies of manufacture and demand that are tied together in Salazar's letter to Philip II, and the ways in which Flanders and the Philippines were conceptually and materially entangled not only in terms of economic supply and demand, but in cultivating and allowing artists to develop new kinds of art objects to compete in a global marketplace. First, and only very briefly, because I'm sure this is all known to you, of course, there's the example of the Santo Niño de Cebu, whose origin story, of course, is that he was left by Magellan as a gift to the unnamed wife of Raja Humaban, the ruler of Cebu, who had converted to Christianity. And when 40 years later, Legazpi returns to conquer the islands, right? A Spanish soldier rediscovers this statue, and he describes him, according to Briquel, as, quote, a child Jesus like those found in Flanders. So small scale wooden sculptures like this one, and like the one I'm showing you in the middle, were mass produced in Mechlin in Flanders and carried across the world by sailors and soldiers. So Hernan Cortez supposedly carries a Virgin a statue very similar to this when, in battle in New Spain. And these export objects are small, they're relatively portable and lightweight. And they also are, it seems from both of these sources, specifically associated with Flanders. They're understood, their point of origin is legible, at least to those in the Spanish Orba. And Salazar's letter of 1590 also suggests that this kind of Flemish sculpture was still the stylistic barometer against which all other sculptural work was assessed within the empire. Then these ivory Santo Niños were some of the most popular export statues made in Manila, and they're found now across Latin America. The two that I'm showing you at the right here, in fact, are in a museum in Monterrey in northern Mexico. Salazar suggests that how Manila's carvers supplanted the need for imports from Spain and from Flanders, but the material record also suggests, sorry, I'm having a problem with my, that these artists were also responsible for creating new markets for their work, supplanting Flemish imports in key ways. These ivory figures are larger, and as you can see from the examples on the right, they support the addition of extremely beautiful and, of course, expensive silver accessories, crowns, necklaces, other accoutrements. Now, this process is even clearer, I think, in my second example this evening, which is a key case study from my forthcoming book, The First Viral Images, Martin de Vos Antwerp Print and the Early Modern Globe, which really focuses on this central iconographic example. The engraving at upper right is from Antwerp, published in 1584 by formerly Protestant printmakers who are seeking to appeal to a powerful Spanish patron. Its unusual iconography, an unarmed figure of Michael with his arm upstretched, his standing atop this kind of serpentine devil, dressed in Atlantica robes with beautiful sort of curly hair and ringed with these kind of swathes of billowing fabric, makes it particularly easy to recognize this iconographic type. And this print, again, like the example we've just seen with Professor Hyman, this print alongside presumably thousands of other impressions of it traveled from, again, Antwerp to Seville, Seville to Veracruz, Veracruz to Mexico City or to Acapulco, and all the way to Manila. There, it proved a hugely successful model for local ivory carvers. And to craft an ivory figure based on a print, as we can see in these versions here, these sangle carvers first had to acquire the print either from patrons or elsewhere, and there's no documentary evidence. And I think this is a real an issue, I think, that art historians have to, working on these kinds of objects, have to grapple with, that there, we have no signatures, we have no commission documents, nothing related to the production of these types of objects. But the fact that we have this correspondence visually between the iconography of prints and not just in this example, but in a range of ivory objects from plaquettes, small triptychs to larger freestanding sculptures, gives us the evidence that these printed models or drawn copies after them are circulating in sangle workshops. And it suggests as well that the ivory carvers of Manila are recognizing and responding to demand for popular subjects and form, and basing new kinds of artistic products on these imported prints. So European gatekeepers may have controlled at first the official access to these kinds of prints, but the sheer number of copies made after that one print testifies to how intermediary copies, that is drawn copies, publicly available sculpted copies, could propel a design's continued use beyond a sort of singular transaction, beyond one commission. We have evidence here that there's about 20 surviving Archangel Michaels that I've identified that relate to this print. So considerable evidence that there is not just one, but probably a couple workshops producing this iconography over a series of decades. In ivory sculptors' workshops, this small print, right? So the print is the size of a piece of paper, and to these larger ivory sculptures, some of which are about 4 feet tall, means that you have to really dramatically reconceive the iconography as a 3-dimensional form. The system of graphic cross-hatching that's used in this print was not well appreciated by Chinese trained artists until much later in the 18th century. And so interpreting this sort of dense network of lines, as well as the sort of foreign iconographic elements, is all work that had to be accomplished in the Manila workshops of these ivory carvers. You also had to work out the efficient use of the tusk form, right? So these sculptures that I'm showing on the screen now are all composed of at least 10 pieces, oftentimes a lot more than that. All those joins are carefully hidden by details like the rolled up sleeves or by the costume itself, or the joins of the wings. But all that kind of complex spatial reasoning and design choices are not inherent in the sort of iconographic model, right? So what I want to kind of stress is that there's no equivalent to this kind of sculptural practice in European ivory sculpture of this moment. And the size of this of these sculptures also seems to indicate that they are working with African ivory. That is, the diameter of some of the largest pieces is larger than 11 centimeters, which is related to the African species of elephant. And so in some ways, the confluence, the availability of this exotic material, that is African ivory coming from across the Indian Ocean, is helping to spur kind of artistic and commercial innovation in the production of these large-scale sculptures. So artisans in Manila are able to get both raw ivory from both the Portuguese and Spanish controlled routes, but also through the networks of South Asian traders from Malindi, from Zanzibar, and then later from Mozambique with the Portuguese trade in the Indian Ocean, to transport African ivory to Manila. And the union of the Spanish and Portuguese crowns in this period, so the kind of porousness of that, of those two networks in the Indian Ocean, may have assisted the movement of ivory from East Africa to the Philippines, either through Goa and the Moluccas or through Macau to Manila. But I think what I want to kind of stress to you is that this is all of these inputs are coming into these local Manila workshops, and this is a particularly new kind of product that's developed in Manila that doesn't have a direct antecedent in any of those separate inputs, either iconographic or material. So the St. Michael the Archangel's viral leap from print to sculpture in the Philippines responded to Indian Ocean circuits of trade and concepts of value, the accessibility of African ivory, as well as Manila artists' exposure to Chinese as well as Indian forms of carving, and European print, and European and Latin American demands for this kind of good. The ways in which artists in Manila's ivory sculptural workshops then are responding to all these diverse inputs far exceeds Salazar's narrative about sort of skillful sanglé mimicry, illuminating how these artists capitalized upon global networks and infrastructures of exchange to produce a rival luxury export. Now, Flanders was undoubtedly a source of the sculpted and some of the sculpted and engraved models used by Manila's ivory carvers, but it also represented something of an exemplar for the Spanish colony in this Pacific, and that Flanders and the Philippines were both places that were exporters of luxury goods across the Spanish world. The numerous ivory sculptures of St. Michael made in the Philippines then reveal more than the dominance of Flemish artistic exemplars in the Spanish world, or the successful conversion of Tagalog or Chinese populations in Manila. Instead, they demonstrate the ways in which Manila's local artists were responding and entering into and exploiting transoceanic trade networks, both across the Pacific and, sort of by virtue of that across the Atlantic, as well as responding to inputs from the Indian Ocean. Drawing on these interwoven Chinese, South Asian, Portuguese, and Spanish meshworks stretching across multiple oceans. And Manila's ivory workshops supplement the Spanish imperial and Catholic infrastructures that enabled the printed model to reach Manila in the first place, and for these ivory sculptures to find their way back to New Spain or to Europe. The production of these ivory objects relied on African and Asian networks far outside of European control. And this is something that I think resonates with what Professor Hyman just said, that there are it's not just a one-way system here, as well as techniques of ivory carving and decoration that were shared across the Indian Ocean and across the Pacific. So some of the painting motifs, the polychromy on these sculptures relates to both South Asian textile production, as well as the use of lacquer as a binding agent in some of the gilding. For example, in the black and white image on the lower left that's in Baltimore has been analyzed, is using these Asian lacquer as a binder. So technical innovation, as well as sort of artistic innovation, as well as a sort of commercial innovation, are all represented in these objects, which simultaneously kind of reenact, but also can, I think, point to ways in which these imperial, mercantile, and missionary sort of territories or claims to global sovereignty can all be sort of tested and contested in the story of these objects making. So with that, I want to finish because I know I want to have time for to hear from the volume's editors, but thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Porras, for that very interesting presentation as well, for taking us through the technical, cultural, and even economic impact, I guess, of how materials are translated from two-dimensional to three-dimensional imagery. And now, thank you again to all of our three speakers for your very insightful presentations. To all of our attendees, just a reminder, if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box or on our Facebook live video chat box. We'd like to now invite our editors, Dr. Priyadarshini and Dr. Baker, to share their responses. May we begin with Dr. Nina Baker. Oh. There, you're good.
Okay, good. Again, good evening and good morning to everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank profusely our guest speakers, Dr. Ruth Llobet, Dr. Aaron Hyman, and Dr. Stephanie Porras for joining us and for sharing their wonderful talks and comments. Dr. Llobet for giving this wonderful overview of the essays and situating the volume in the context of Philippine historiography. Dr. Hyman for sharing his amazing research which resonates personally with me, because I'm currently working on a very related topic on the connections between 19th century Philippine paintings and Flemish iterations, Flemish originals, actually, specifically Rubens, and Dr. Stephanie Porras for, again, sharing your research, specifically on this viral image of Martin de Vos, by Martin de Vos, of the San Miguel Arcangel ivory iterations in the Philippines. So thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of some of our contributors, whom we will be able, I hope, will share their thoughts with us as well later. These are Fernando Shalcita, who wrote about the birth of Filipino culture on the galleons. Feliz Prudente Santa Maria, who shared this wonderful essay on food, on Philippine cuisine and Transpacific translations of taste. Sandra Castro is here as well, who wrote about piña, embroidered pineapple fabrics as an expression of national identity. Our book designer, Ige Ramos, is here as well, and we'd like to also hear from him a little bit later. Yinghe Jiang is who wrote about the Cantonese workshops, has joined us as well. And of course, we're joined by two of our publishers, the directors of two of our publishers, Professor Dr. Gerhard Wolf from the Kunsthistorisches Institute in Florence, and our Mariles Gustilo of Ayala Museum. So thank you all. Before I turn the floor over to Meha, who has some thoughts as well on the what Aaron, Dr. Hyman has referred to as the challenges and rewards of this Connecting Art Histories project. I'd like to first share a few images with you, just a couple of images that I'm pulling out from an exhibition that I curated that opened recently at Ayala Museum, at the newly renovated galleries of Ayala Museum, which might have specific resonance to our speakers, Dr. Porras and Dr. Hyman. And I just wanted to share these images as maybe pointing towards possible strategies for our volume 2 of the Transpacific Engagements. Of course, we're launching this volume, but we're already kind of looking to the future, looking at lessons learned, looking at various strategies for further research and what the next steps should be. And of course, we'd like your input as well. But I'd like to share this fabulous San Miguel Arcangel. That is one of the key objects in our exhibition entitled Intertwined, Transpacific, Transcultural Philippines, which was actually inspired by the Transpacific volume that we are celebrating today. So it's kind of this sequence of events that lead to each other. In the introduction, our museum director and senior director for arts and cultures at Ayala Foundation and Ayala Museum mentioned the seminal Transpacific Engagements conference that we convened at Ayala Museum in 2014 with the collaboration of the Kunsthistorisches Institute and the Getty Research Institute. And so that conference actually, again, was generated by a scholarly year, a scholar theme at the Getty Research Institute, which focused on connecting histories, connecting seas. So that scholar year at the Getty gave birth to the conference that was held in Manila, which in turn kind of generated this volume that we have now. And the volume itself generated in turn this exhibition called Intertwined Transpacific Transcultural Philippines that is currently on view at Ayala Museum, that you can also access online, some of the highlights. And I hope that some of you will be able to, if you are in Manila, please visit Ayala Museum. And if you are overseas, I hope the exhibition will be on for an extended period. So I hope at some point you might be able to visit the exhibition in person. So just to again reiterate some of the characteristics of this 17th century San Miguel Arcangel that Dr. Porras discussed in detail, you see a very similar iconography that clearly derives from the prints by 17th century prints by Flemish printmakers, in particular Martin de Vos, which are based on Flemish originals that were translated in three-dimensional form using the medium of ivory. And I wanted to share the next image, which is, if I could have the next image. This is an installation view, but I'd like to get Dr. Hyman excited about this because I am so excited about working further on this coronation image. I searched your book for a Rubens for original, but I guess your book did not cover the coronation theme. But here is a 19th century Philippine coronation image with the Virgin Mary, of course, being crowned by Jesus Christ, God the Father, and the Holy Spirit is hovering in the middle. And looking at this closely, I was so intrigued by it. I found several other versions by other Filipino artists. This is by an unidentified artist, although I have some ideas about it, about the authorship, which is purely speculation at this point. But there are signed versions by artists such as Mariano Asuncion. There are other versions from the from the so-called Asuncion school. And so looking at these various iterations gave me the idea of, well, you know, it's a conventionalized iconography that probably derives from elsewhere. And looking at Latin America, I discovered some wonderful Peruvian examples as well. And it became very clear that it's actually can be traced back to a Rubens coronation. We only have the oil sketch existing, which is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, since the large mural had been destroyed during World War II, which was in Germany. So I think this is, I just share these images just to kind of give a two specific examples of other conversations that we might have as we move forward with this book and with these conversations tonight and beyond tonight. So there, now I'd like to turn the floor over to Meha, who might have more to say about the rewards and the challenges that we faced during this putting this volume together and working with our distinguished contributors. Maya.
Great. I think I've managed to, yes, I'm unmuted. Thank you to our three speakers for your comments today. It's really gratifying to finally see that, how the book is being read and how it can be useful to people from different fields, right? And you all mentioned that it is interdisciplinary, and we weren't, it doesn't necessarily have one single audience. So it's nice to see that you could all get something from it. And one thing that I'm really glad that you all picked up on in different ways is how we were in the volume trying to play with the idea of geography in different ways, both actually in terms of the global connections that the book highlights, but also in terms of how the volume came together, and the contributions that they came from all over the world as well. So I'll speak to both of those points. So first, the different the geography of the world that we're highlighting in the volume. So Ruth, this idea that that the Philippines is not the back door of the Spanish Empire, that's exactly one of the aims of the book, to say that Trans-Pacific studies and global history and art history in general need to take the Philippines more seriously, precisely because of its importance in to these big empires, and also to global trade of the early modern period. Erin, I really appreciated you bringing in the transatlantic, because we do want to also invite experts of other sort of global connections to be able to read the book and to take what could be useful to them from it. And I think what you propose of putting the transatlantic and the transpacific together is really important, not just to think about the connections, but how we study those two connections, and why do we emphasize certain things when we study the transatlantic versus the transpacific. So just juxtaposing them is very interesting. And you also picked up that we wanted to go beyond the Manila-Acapulco axis. So thank you for that. And then Stephanie, in discussing the ivories, you were able to bring in other places that we didn't necessarily cover the whole world, or the many ways in which the Philippines even was connected to other parts of the world. But it is a start in that direction, right? That we need to think beyond the geographies of not only of our disciplines, but even, we think of transatlantic as being one, transpacific, and then the Indian Ocean is one. But really, there were also connections between these that haven't been explored enough, precisely because we get sort of siloed in these categories. And also this idea of bringing together specialists of different materials. And I think you meant really the materials, right? You mentioned the ivory, but we had textiles, and Ruth mentioned the Cantonese paintings. And this precisely the other thing that the volume was trying to do was to introduce to some people, like Stephanie, the ivories, you already know them, but there might be others, such as myself, who worked on ceramics but doesn't know the ivory. So one of the aims of the volume was precisely to be able to show the wide breadth of materials that you could study Trans-Pacific history from. So thank you for highlighting all of that. I want to just briefly then mention that in order to do that, it wasn't always easy, but it has been very rewarding. And a question came up while we were emailing with our speakers for tonight. I think, Erin, you asked us about doing this connected history, not just in terms of the connections highlighted, but connecting scholars. And I think I've mentioned this before, this idea of doing global history globally, I I think we all agree that it sounds very nice, but it's not done very much. We still don't have very many examples of volumes that actually bring in scholars from beyond the, let's say, what we imagine as centers of academia. So one of the things we were hoping to also inspire with this volume is precisely this kind of collaborative work that that not only invites scholars to collaborate, but also allows sort of the freedom to collaborate in a way that's familiar to them. I think one of the challenges we faced was precisely that: how do we bring all of this scholarship together, bring all of these different intellectual training and traditions together in a way that celebrates that diversity, rather than sort of making everything uniform. So we went for the way of allowing people to be true to their training, rather than trying to make everything seem like it came out of the same mold. This is just one example of that, but we hope that we see more work such as this. Maybe we ourselves will continue on down this line, as Nina mentioned. I also want to acknowledge some people. I think you've been hearing the names of the three big institutions that worked on, that of course made the conference possible and then the volume possible. But they were three very big, very different institutions, and bringing them together has been very rewarding. But it only worked because we had people beyond me and Nina and beyond the directors working to make that happen. I want to acknowledge some of those people, because you wouldn't necessarily, they're very much on the backstage, as actually the speakers know, because you've been in touch with them backstage in this very Zoom webinar. So at the Getty Research Institute, I want to acknowledge Kim Richter's role in making this possible. At the Kunsthistorische Institute, Eva Musatter, and at the Ayala Museum, Dita Samson, Marie Julianente, who I know as Jay, and I think she's there today. I don't know if it's going to be possible for you to turn your cameras on, but if it is, and if you could wave, it would be great if people could acknowledge the incredible work you've done on this volume. And finally, Tenten, who you are able to see today because she's doing such a great job chairing our event today. I will end with talking to you briefly about the geography issue again through the book itself, the physical book. And I don't know if Stephanie still has her camera on, or if we can turn her camera on so she can show you the physical book. And show you the map. Stephanie, would you mind actually flipping a couple pages to where you see that map? Yeah, exactly. So another person we need to acknowledge, who Nina already mentioned, Ige Ramos, who was the designer for the book. We had long conversations about maps for the book. And Aaron, you mentioned that the map stood out for you. Yeah, they were a big deal in the book in a lot of ways. So of course we wanted a map that centered the Pacific. And you'd be surprised at how much people still aren't able to imagine the world with the Pacific at the center, right? We're so used to seeing the Atlantic in the center, and it really does change the way you see the world if it's the Pacific in the middle. But then we also wanted to highlight the many different connections that the book had. You know, the different scholars are able to bring in different sites that you might not necessarily think of. And Stephanie did this also in her presentation, you don't necessarily think of Flanders and Manila together, and that's precisely one of the aims of the book. So we had wanted a map with all these places, but that wasn't possible, and so then Ige came up with something really cool. Yes, there it is, which we managed to use as the end papers for the book. And what's really brilliant about what is happening here, and I don't know if we want to show the image that you have. I think we have an image that the audience will be able to see better. But basically, this is the map has highlighted specific places in the world, but what you'll see, what Stephanie's holding up here, you see India and China really well, and next to India on the left are the Mariana Islands, which we don't necessarily on a global scale think of very much at all. Of course, they were very important for the Trans-Pacific trade, but what's brilliant here is precisely that actually they in Ige's conceptualization, they take up as much space on that page as India and China, if not more, precisely to get you to think about their importance in that way. And so we're very grateful to him for coming up with this. And the end papers precisely force you to think differently about how the world was connected and the places that allowed for those connections to happen, which is yeah, so here you have this. And I think I will end on that note. I know there's at least one, there are several questions that I think Tenten will moderate for us.
And if I may jump in, Meha, I think Ige is joining us tonight, and he might want to.
Oh yeah, if you
want to acknowledge him, and he might want to come on screen. Ige, are you able to turn on your camera and say a few words?
Yeah, especially if you want to tell a bit about your process, because it really was a collaboration. Oh, he can't. He says he can't.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Well, when you get your hands in the book, you will see his amazing work.
Okay, thank you for your comments, Dr. Piadarshini and Dr. Baker. Again, that's a great way to synthesize the volume. Perhaps we can invite our speakers if you'd like to share any responses as well to the comments of Dr. Baker and Dr. Piadarshini. But in the meantime, if I may open the floor just for a few questions. I know we're a bit already over the time we had allotted, but we'll try to condense some of the questions because we have quite a few in our chat. So I think one of the questions really that emerges here is, aside from the materials that are covered in the publication, I think people are also showing an interest in what other expressions of culture were exchanged across the Pacific. And this in particular is in relation to literary works and music. So I don't know if there's anyone from the group who might want to address that. But aside from objects and cultural expressions, there's also a question of the exchange, or rather the movement of people, both across the Pacific and across the Atlantic. And this is with regards to, I suppose, migration, as well as the movement of slaves. So I don't know if anyone wants to respond to these questions.
Well, I think in looking at the movement of African ivory, I was looking for the movement, like the parallel movement of other types of goods, but also of enslaved people. And there was a gift very early, I think it's 1597, of, I think it's 4 enslaved African men that are given by a Jesuit, somebody connected to the Jesuit church, so a patron in Goa, to Manila, to the cathedral, or sorry, to the Jesuit church. So like there is a movement of people as well, and that's probably the earliest record that I know of. I'm sure there are earlier, there might be other ones, but to me, given there's no documented evidence, or no documents, so no archival textual reference to the movement of African ivory, I was able to kind of connect that movement of people that is only sort of tangentially referenced into the physical objects. But yeah, there certainly is movement, I think, across the Indian Ocean.
There is, if you allow me to add, in Southeast Asia actually is the entrance of slavery is a kind of like very diverse. There is a part that comes from Africa, but then there is also another part that comes from enslaved people within Southeast Asia, especially for the 17th and 18th century, especially with the South Sultanates, which they do these razzias, and then they sell the Filipinos, the Christian Filipinos, and other people in Jakarta and in Johor and in the Malay Peninsula. Together with also, like there is in the documentation, there is a lot of also the slaves that come through with Indian merchants. It's like I remember reading testaments, like kind of wills of like Armenian and Indian merchants in Manila, giving the freedom to the slaves, or then to basically stating who was going to inherit the state, like the slave. But it's not so much as, at least I have never encountered documentation from slaves coming from America. So mainly as a local enslaved population, or then African population that derives from Dutch or Portuguese colonies.
Yeah, if I can just, oh, no, Aaron, you go first.
You're probably going to say the same thing that I was going to say, which is that Tatiana
Yeah.
Sejas has written a really excellent.
You do the Tatiana Sejas, and I'll talk about the book.
Okay. So Tatiana Sejas, who's a historian at Rutgers, has written a really interesting book on Asian slaves in New Spain, which challenges some of our presumptions about who could be enslaved in the space of the Spanish Empire. And I think that's a really interesting corrective to only kind of thinking about Africa as and African people of African origin as enslavable in any kinds of these imperial spaces. So I would suggest that point. And I wrote in the chat, but when we were talking about music and musical trade, David Brading wrote a really interesting book, Colonial Counterpoint, about the movement of music and musical tracks from Europe through New Spain, also other trade networks, but Europe and its relationship to Manila in terms of musical exchange.
Yeah, great. So just to say, in terms of our volume, the three institutions that were sort of doing this are institutions that work on our historical institutions, right? So that was the focus of obviously of this volume, but that's not to say that those are the only sort of ways in which exchanges were happening, and we should be thinking of course, other ways of thinking about these exchanges.
Oh, and if I could jump in as well, Aaron, we did actually try to get David Irving to contribute something on music, the exchange of music across the Trans-Pacific, but he wasn't able to contribute at this point, though. To continue with that thought of incorporating music and cuisine among the objects that we study regarding, exchanges, multidisciplinary and multi-directional exchanges, we did incorporate a section on music and kundiman in the ongoing exhibition that we have at Ayala Museum. And that will also be covered in the catalog that is coming out. Yes. So, and I'd like to maybe at this point call on some of our authors that I see are here, and perhaps they could share their thoughts on the volume as a whole. When we invited them to contribute, they hadn't seen the entire volume. So now that the volume is out, and you see your work in the context of the whole volume, could you share your thoughts with us about how you feel about the volume itself, and how you feel your work fits into this collection? Perhaps we could start with Feliz Santa Maria, who contributed on Philippine cuisine.
Well, I'd like to thank the editors for incorporating an article about cuisine and for spotlighting the Philippine example as one of culinary crossovers. The realm of food history has a long way to go. It is, of course, transdisciplinary. And the difficulties of food history, trying to fit it into the context of the kind of work that I see in the book, is that we are dealing with ephemerality most of the time. You know, this is dealing with, you can have an asado and it's not going to last 500 years, unlike an ivory statue, for instance. And one will not find, or we're still searching for handwritten documentation of, for instance, how the missionaries cooked. That still evades us simply because we are not enough researchers. And so I think by the sheer inclusion of one article in this wonderful book, to me, that is a signal that perhaps the field of colonial period food history can have more than one or two researchers in the Philippines. So I thank you very much for that. And I'd also like to point out that it is through food and through the variations of food throughout the centuries that in the Philippines we see that the maritime Southeast Asia, continental Asia, as well as the imperial realm of Spain and later of the United States, the food captures all of that because of the exchange of botanicals, the exchange of culinary technology, procedures, the various social underpinnings, one might say, in the types of cooking. So again, I just want to thank you for bringing out the importance of these transcultural intangibles that are the foods we eat. And the fact that one can continue to write about the social and spiritual dimensions of food as they change because of the different entanglements or engagements, as the book calls them. So that's my little statement on this wonderful collaboration.
Thank you, Felice. And speaking of food scholarship, it's a field. I know that internationally, I think there's growing interest in this as well among our international colleagues. But food history seems to be becoming quite a popular field in the Philippines itself. And I'm seeing on camera our talented book designer, Ige Ramos, who himself is also a food historian. So Ige, are you now able to share some of your thoughts about the whole process of collaborating with us on the map, and maybe share some of your thoughts as well on this developing field of food history?
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm not wearing an earphone. Well, thank you very much, Meha and Dr. Baker. I love you, Nina.
I love you too.
For including me in this project. It's a really interesting, exciting project, especially I read the manuscript, like I had all the time in the world because of the pandemic. And I was like really leisurely, consolidating the vision of the different authors and the vision of Nina and Mea in formulating the book. And because I cannot, you don't design anything in a vacuum, you really have to get all the information. And with that, I was able to identify the fonts. I had all the time in the world to research on fonts. So I got this beautiful font called 1522 Vicentino. it's a handmade font, no? And I use that for the titles. And then of course, not to forget the 16th century typeface of Garamond, but it's a modern Coromant Garamond, which is a very, very exciting typeface. I'm not talking now here as a food writer, not like putting things together like a, like a recipe or testing a recipe. But for me, book design is one discipline that I really care about, and it's really exciting to work with editors, and they don't treat you like just a mere layout artist, but part of the process in bringing out, like the different things, like all the different elements. Like for instance, you have like secret things in the book. Like for instance, at the back, okay, I won't show it to you. I mean, you can look at your copies. Behind, there's like a running line. There's like, how can I, wait, I'll just, anyway, there's a line here. It's actually the prime meridian. So there's like dark and light at the back. So it's a very, very, subtle design in terms of, and then very subtle, it's not shouting. It's quite, I mean, I hate to say it. I mean, I hate to use the word elegant, but more of like, there's like a subtleness in design. Like for instance, the map, like the color scheme, it's indigo, of course, because of the textiles, the indigo, and then pure cyan, which is like the purest form of blue in printing, which is the blinding color of the sea, and ochre and ochre, which is like the color of Spain, like almost like that ochre feeling. So these are like the colors that played in my mind, no? And it's really hard to design like an anthology because each person is saying a different thing. So I have to choose, let's say, a key image to open the chapter, and then of course like the maps. That was like a really, really long process. We started with different maps, and then we ended up with the original concept, which I have to fight tooth and nail. Well, not really fight, but like really discuss with Meha what I really wanted to do. So all in all, it was a very, very fulfilling project, at least for me, creatively and artistically, because I think this is like one of those once in a lifetime project that I did. Like I
There's
felt
volume 2.
Yay! Like this is like the same feeling that I had when I was designing Felice's book, The Governor General's Kitchen, wherein we also collaborated in terms of the design, like, so anyway, I'm digressing too much already. So thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity, and I hope to see you either in Manila or in New York or in Edinburgh or even in Florence and in everywhere. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you again. I think we have Dr. Shalsita with us as well, who argues in his essay that Filipino mainstream culture, lowland culture as we know it today, was actually born on the galleons. So Dr. Shalsita, would you like to share some of your thoughts with us? Oh, you're mute. You need to unmute yourself, please.
There.
Okay.
Good evening, Florina. Good evening, Meha. Good evening, everybody. First of all, I want to borrow the phrase of Ige Ramos that this is a once-in-a-lifetime project. I'm so happy because it coincides with the theme I've been pursuing since I was a young man, namely the theme of identity. It has been quite difficult for Filipinos to identify who we are. because of the many influences coming together. It also has been difficult for specialists in Asia and Southeast Asia to try to figure out how to fit us into their classificatory scheme. I've always argued that the big problem is that these constructs, East versus West, Asia versus Europe, were invented when Europeans actually didn't know much about the rest of the world. They were also invented when the world was flat and also before the Pacific was discovered. But you know, they don't really make sense on a global scale, nor within the Pacific. Although we know, of course, East and West are symbolic terms, nonetheless, it's worth noting that really the Philippines, Indonesia, Japan, and China are to the west of the United States and Spanish America. I think we really have to connect the Philippines to the Pacific. We have to locate it in the Pacific. And I think that's where what Nick Joaquin, one of our best writers in English, said makes sense. He said that some people say the Philippines is Western, others Eastern. I say that the Philippines is neither Eastern nor Western, neither North or South for that matter. The Philippines is all of these, and we should be proud of it. And I'm glad this book is able to locate the Philippines on a wider scale, precisely within the Pacific. And so the Philippines makes sense within the Pacific. And now that the Asia-Pacific community is gaining more traction, it's becoming more palpable, I think we should be happy about being able to connect to different parts of the Pacific via our food, by our textiles, by our celebrations. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have two more authors who are with us, Sandra Castro and Yinghe Jiang. Maybe Sandra, would you like to say a few words?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, loud
Yeah,
and
you can hear
clear.
me. Oh, okay. Thank you for including my my short essay. I had written about piña embroidery in the past, but I don't think Filipinos or people overseas realize that it was associated with Manila. Piña embroidery was always associated with Manila. And I mentioned there that in Switzerland, where they were making machine-made lace, they called one of their designs Manila, and it was white work embroidery, something that is not indigenous to the Philippines, but they realized that it was from Manila. It had been adopted and adapted. So that was the gist of the article. But was looking at sources about textiles during the colonial period, you can really say there are very many trans-Pacific occurrences. Like just in terminology, we don't just have vernacular and Spanish terms in textiles. We also have coyote, which I guess is from Mexico, and it referred to a type of cotton which was dyed in the color of the coyote's fur. And then, of course, we also had the raw silk from China, which in the Philippines is called husi. So that was a name that was derived from China. Anyway, it was also nice to hear the other academics speak today, Dr. Llobet, Dr. Hyman, and Dr. Porras. And it made me excited about other things that I've seen in Intramuros Administration Museum. Like Professor Hyman was focusing on copies. So this is a very critical thing when in the museum world, you catalog things and you're asked to identify provenance and creator. And immediately people think when the provenance is Manila, then it's made by Filipinos. So it's more complicated than that. And thank you for showing us the ivory images of the San Miguel, Dr. Porras. You will see a lot of those in Intramuros Administration if you visit Manila, and you'll also see icons of San Miguel and some later San Miguel ivories, maybe later in the 19th century, where they are smaller and they are enclosed in globe jars. They called virinas. Anyway, that's all I want to share today. Thank you to everybody.
Thank you, Sandy. And would like to hear maybe from Ying He, who wrote about the Cantonese export workshops.
Hello, everyone. Nice to meet you all. First of all, I want to thank you, especially Dr. Nina Becker. It reminded me that when I was in Brown University 7 years ago, we met in the Holy Cross College when I give lectures there to talk about the workshop, the Cantonese export painting workshop studium at that time. Yeah, my research focused on the Cantonese export paintings or export commodities in 18th and 19th centuries. And as my research, I want to show that Canton is not only a Chinese port, but also a melting pot of cultural exchange. So I just choose the Chinese Cantonese export painting as a research project. But besides export paintings, we have a lot of all kinds of export commodities. For example, just now, you said that the ivory carvings or textiles, and also some kind of a very interesting food. So I think this volume brought us a lot of interesting topics about the culture exchange. But for me, because I can only speak English, or I can only understand English, not Spanish or Portuguese. So maybe I pay more attention to the west side of the Chinese, the intercourse with the Chinese is the British or the United States. So, but I think today I'm thinking more about the role of the Philippines, or the role, the more important role of Manila, because a lot of overseas Chinese, especially from the Fujian province, they went to Philippines, I think from 15th centuries or 16th centuries. They make a lot of contribution to the Sino-foreign relations, especially Transpacific route to the New Mexico. I have found a lot of interesting stuff here in Fujian province, also in the museums in the United States and in Holland or Great Britain, but I cannot explain because I cannot read Spanish. I went to the West India archive in Sevilla in Spain 3 years ago. I know a lot of stuff there, archives and documents there, but I cannot understand. It's a pity. And now we have, I want to say is we have a study center for the Canton port in our university. And we have connected a lot of archives, documents of the European East India companies, and also the American merchant families document here. So if you, and we want to bring more and more scholars to Canton, to Guangzhou, to our university, we can use the, we can use the documents and all kinds of stuff here, and we can cooperate on a lot of project. So I think maybe welcome all of you to come to Guangzhou someday, and we can meet everywhere in the whole world.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Wonderful.
So,
thank you for that. Thank you for that.
more.
A lot of us are going to take that
So
that offer.
I think maybe we can have another next event together, or next publication.
Definitely. See, we're already talking about volume 2 and maybe volume 3.
That's great.
And also, since you're both on the screen together, I wanted to also reiterate this interest that Sandra Castro has about the possibility of embroidered piña possibly being replicated in Canton. Would you have any information about that, or connect us to some scholars? Are there scholars in China specializing on pineapple embroideries and white work?
Maybe I don't know much about that. Maybe, yeah.
Okay, we'd have to visit you there. We're
Yeah,
organizing
you must
a
come. I think
trip right
Canton,
now.
You know,
We're-
actually Canton is some kind of it is the south gate of China facing to the Western world. So we always say the
Right.
Cantonese, they go everywhere in the world. You can
Right.
meet the Cantonese everywhere, and they speak Cantonese, they speak Mandarins, and a lot of overseas Chinese is from this place.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. So I think you
Yes.
must come here someday. We can
Yes.
organize some kind of workshop or conference.
Okay, we'll take you up on that.
Yeah,
Cantonese,
I will be the
Cantonese.
organizer.
We
Good,
can
thank
do
you.
we can do a food tour and do a food research.
Yeah, I want to see
Like
the lot of
Mackenzie
historical sites in
cuisine and
Canton.
Cantonese.
Yeah.
Wonderful,
ask-
Some of you can
wonderful.
speak Cantonese.
No, unfortunately.
Okay.
Sandra,
No, I just had a question because not a lot of us speak Fujianese, but we know there's a very strong connection between the Philippines and the Fujianese. So I was wondering if there are any archival documents related to, little workshops in southern China catering to the Philippine clientele, because there's ivories, there's silver, there's textiles that are clearly Chinese in, the material or the motifs are from there, but they're hard to pin down.
Yeah, I don't think there are many Chinese documents here because maybe I know a lot of overseas Chinese from Fujian. They moved to immigrate to Manila in 16th century. They learned to, I think maybe they have baptized by the Spanish priest. And then they went to Mexico by the Spanish ships. So they have a very special, the agent of the trade, or the agent of the cultural exchange. Because I found some very interesting paintings here in Fujian and in Guangzhou. We don't know who painted, and we don't know where the paintings come from, but I think maybe they come from Manila by the Fujianese. Because, when we talk about the export painting was always made in the 18th centuries. But just the paintings I mentioned just now is from 16th century or 17th century, much earlier than the Cantonese export painting. And at that time, and the Fujianese, I think, are more active than the Cantonese people.
thank you. Thank you for
Thank
that.
you very
So
much.
informative. Yes. We'd like to turn the floor over to Tenten. I think you're opening the floor to questions from our audience.
Yes, thank you. That was a very interesting discussion between our contributors to the volume. Unfortunately, we're pressed for time. It's almost 10 o'clock, so we'll just have to perhaps jump to one question that we'd just like to quickly run by everyone. And I suppose this is for our younger participants who are in the room. They would like to ask, for this new generation of people who are very tech savvy and are on the internet, who are on TikTok and IG, what would the key learnings you would like for them to take away from all of the research that you've conducted, not just within the volume, I suppose, but extending from the volume of Transpacific Engagements and the conference as well. So perhaps we can just quickly go around the floor and go through each. Can we start perhaps with Dr. Hyman?
Sure, yeah, I can jump in. I sort of started to answer this in the QA feature of this, but I think it's really important for a younger generation of people and just the broader public more generally to realize that this kind of globalized world that we live in and the connectivity that it enables really rests upon these material histories and is still dependent upon them and the inequalities and material flows that they created. And I also think one other piece of that is that it's very simple to think of the flows in a global world of TikTok and Instagram and Facebook as being frictionless. And I think, both Stephanie and my work, one really important term for us has been sort of friction, delays, recursions, all of these places in which transit is messy, because I think actually the kind of frictionlessness of global interconnectivity is in many ways a fiction, and in many ways the conditions in which we live in are much closer to the early modern experience of lapses and lags and interferences than we would often like to admit. And we've seen that very kind of palpably and poignantly in the last few years with the COVID pandemic, just how tenuous our systems of transmission really are and how easily interrupted they can be. So I think studying the past really allows us to come to terms with those questions and to see those terms much more sensitively than we might otherwise.
Well, Erin answered that so beautifully. I have no further things to say. I mean, I think that's a lot of what my work has. I use the term viral somewhat, in a way to address that younger audience and have them understand in a kind of instant way what we're talking about when talking about the movement of images, and also the understanding of agency that is distributed, right? I think younger people who are familiar with social media understand that the act of like creating a meme or moving, repeating or forwarding something is an act of identification. And I think that, is a creative process or contributes something to a kind of broader cultural moment or whatever. And I think that understanding that intuitively is useful in teaching the early modern. Now, not to propose that it's a sort of teleological, like they're exactly the same, but to prime us to think about things like networks and gatekeepers and who's a kind of promoter of content, who is a restrictor of content, who is, what are the as Erin said, right? Like where are the transit points slippery or where are they like get congested? And it's, I think I find it very useful for teaching really, in particular.
I think following with the ideas of Erin and your idea too is like, I think what the volume gives is and highlights very well is how all these juxtapositions don't allow a binarism. And then especially in a world that online world is becoming so all or nothing, I think the fact that the volume constructs so many juxtapositions that force to better understand in a deep way the connections, these trans-Pacific, transatlantic, Indian Ocean connections. I think that can be actually a good reflection. And I agree, is also a good material for teaching. Is an excellent material for making understand that also how the transmission between cultures is always a process that is always much more complex than not just like, oh, I bring something here, I copy, and it's like, oh, that's beautiful, I get it. Which at times it seems that this is the pattern that exists nowadays. No, it's like everything is an appropriation when actually the process of creation is always a much more complex, much more rich, much more humane than not an all or nothing.
Perhaps, Meha, do you have anything to add to that?
No, just that our speakers are so articulate.
I know. We're in awe, and we're so honored to have the three of you here. And I would, with the few minutes that we have left, I think Gerhard Wolf is here. Perhaps would you honor us with a few closing remarks? Is he still around?
I don't know, and I'm not sure if he confirmed.
I think he might have gotten disconnected. I think I saw it earlier.
Yeah, he was here earlier. Yeah. For a Manila audience, Dr. Gerhard Wolf is the director of the Kunsthistorisches Institute and was actually quite supportive of this project. So we would like to, I guess, close this celebration with our thanks to the Getty Research Institute, the Consistorios Institute, and Ayala Foundation for embarking on this experimental collaboration that this book would not have been possible without this tri-continental, multi-national, multicultural collaboration. Thank you.
And with that, that marks the end of our session this evening. We'd like to thank again all of our speakers, our esteemed speakers, again, as I mentioned, for being so eloquent and putting together their thoughts with such clarity. So this talk is presented to you by Ayala Foundation in partnership with the Getty Research Institute in the United States and the Consistorios Institute in Florence, the Max Planck Institute in Italy. They are also the co-publishers of the book, which is still available at the Ayala Museum shop, both on-site and online. Copies are also available now for pre-order outside of the Philippines through the Getty Museum store. If you enjoyed this talk and would like to attend similar conversations on this topic, please sign up for the last of our 3 talks on Transpacific Engagements. It will be hosted by the Getty on May 25, 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So that's in the US, or for the audience in the Philippines, that's May 26 at 7 in the morning. So we'd like to hear your feedback. Please visit the link shared in the chat box or scan the QR code flashed on screen. And we'd like to invite everyone to our upcoming programs at Ayala Museum. We will have a virtual curators talk about the exhibition Intertwined Transpacific Transcultural Philippines with Dr. Nina Capistrano-Baker. Check out our website for future announcements. Again, thank you to everyone, and we hope to see you again soon. Please stay safe and healthy and enjoy the rest of your day.